Carlo Gambino's wedding was not the stuff of headlines or lavish pageantry. There were no brass bands, no underworld royalty arriving in fleets of black sedans. Just a modest ceremony, a small circle of relatives, a few trusted friends, and among them, Tommy Lucchese, ever loyal, ever present. It was a quiet affair, but not without meaning. Because when Carlo married Catherine Castellano, his first cousin, it wasn't just a family union, it was a strategic alliance, binding him even closer to the powerful Castellano bloodline. They moved into a two-family house on Ocean Parkway, near the matchmaking aunt who had introduced them, and that house would become the cradle of a family legacy that would stretch through politics, medicine, and the American underworld. In 1927, Gambino became a father for the first time. A daughter, Phyllis. She was the apple of his eye. In a world of violence and silence, she was his softness, and through her, Carlo came to understand the fragility of life, the value of quiet. He was not alone in this. Around him, many of his contemporaries were settling down. Joe Adonis got married. Tom Lucchese had kids. Frank Costello had married long before Prohibition ever began. Only a few men remained unattached. Luciano and Costello, despite their wealth and power, had no children of their own. Luciano would later admit it was his biggest regret. Costello, haunted by childhood poverty, feared dying and leaving a child to suffer the same fate. Instead, he adopted his nieces and nephews, treating them like royalty. But Carlo Gambino embraced fatherhood fully. In 1929, his first son, Thomas, was born named for his godfather, Tom Lucchese. Years later, Thomas would marry Frances Lucchese, Tom's daughter, a Vassar-educated woman from one of the most respected Italian-American families in New York. Then came Joseph Gambino, born in 1936, and later Carlo Jr., sealing the family line. Gambino raised his children with discipline and distance. They worked in the family's legitimate businesses, but never officially made, never inducted into the Mafia, never arrested, never in the headlines. It was intentional. Carlo had seen enough of what the life could do. He wanted something better for them. Despite being one of the most powerful dons in American history, Gambino's criminal record was shockingly mild. A dozen arrests, mostly tied to bootlegging and immigration violations. 2 federal convictions. No murders, no drug charges, no spectacular takedowns. His New York Police Department file was number 8-128760, his FBI number 334450. There were thick dossiers on him scattered across INS, IRS, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, the Waterfront Commission, the Senate Investigations Subcommittee, and a half-dozen other agencies. But the man himself? He was a ghost, clean suits, polite words, a soft voice, and no fingerprints. But the early years weren't spotless. On December 8, 1932, Gambino was arrested in Brockton, Massachusetts, accused of swindling a local out of $1,000 in a con known as the handkerchief and pill game, a classic street hustle. He made bail and vanished, only to have the charges dropped 2 years later when he quietly paid the man back after another fugitive arrest in New York. By the 1930s, Carlo was settled, wealthy and calculating. The volatile Prohibition days were behind him, but Masseria's murder, a seismic shift in the underworld, would soon rattle even the most careful operators. When the news hit, Gambino didn't panic. He watched, listened, calculated. He had a daughter in his arms, a son learning to walk, a mortgage paid in full, and now, with the old order collapsing, he would do what he always did best. Keep his head down. Watch the chaos and wait for the right moment to move. The news hit New York like a thunderclap. Carlo Gambino, barely 30 years old and already a quiet fixture in the underworld, heard the word before the rest of the city caught its breath. Joe Masseria, the old boss, The man who had ruled New York's underworld like a bloated king was dead, murdered, left for dead in a dingy restaurant, a cigarette still smouldering between his fingers. Gambino had seen it coming. He was one of the few who understood the deeper moves at play, watching patiently from the sidelines as the old world tore itself apart. At the time, Gambino was hustling like the rest of them, moving bootleg liquor through the docks, greasing palms, building connections. But he had a secret weapon. He was an artist at forgery. Not just in printing counterfeit money, no. Gambino specialized in forging fake liquor labels. With a sleight hand and a good printer, he could turn $100 worth of cheap booze into $1,000 worth of imported fine spirits. It was a racket born out of Prohibition's chaos, and Gambino understood it better than anyone. He also understood something else: narcotics. Small operations were starting to pop up, heroin moving quietly through the city. Gambino knew that if you could manipulate liquor, you could manipulate anything. But now, with Masseria's death, the structure of organized crime in New York was mutating once again. In Sicily, a murder like this would mean a bloodbath. Families would be wiped out, friends, relatives, everyone who had ever shaken hands with the victim would be marked for death. Gambino braced for war, and yet, it never came. Instead, something almost miraculous unfolded before him. Most of Masseria's men, the ones who should have been sharpening their knives for revenge, had already transitioned to Salvatore Maranzano. They chose forgiveness. They chose to forget. Gambino, too, swallowed the old grudges. Even though Maranzano had once botched an assassination attempt on his own brother, something no Sicilian would ever forgive, Gambino learned to forgive, here, in America. But he will never forget. This was the new breed, Sicilians who wanted to be Americans. Men like Charlie Luciano, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, Benjamin Siegel, Vito Genovese. They were the architects of a new empire. Gambino was different, even among them. He did not care about the respect of the American elite. He wanted the elite in his pocket a tool, not a trophy. He was going to build something different, something lasting, and he was going to let others do the heavy lifting. Now part of Maranzano's camp, Gambino found his niche alongside another rising star, Tommy Lucchese. Together they worked the docks, the gambling halls, the bookmakers, the loan sharks. They seized garbage routes, took over new territories, and watched from the shadows as men like Dutch Schultz fought tooth and nail with Harlem's black community for control of the numbers racket. Once Schultz wore himself out, Gambino and Lucchese would move in and take it all. But before they could crown themselves kings, there was one more obstacle, not just for Gambino, but for Luciano himself. Masseria was gone, and Maranzano wasted no time. Maranzano had it all now, one wise guy remembered later. He didn't waste a single goddamn day. He was going to have the damnedest inauguration that ever took place in the United States of America. Within weeks, Maranzano was planning his coronation, a real medieval pageant to crown himself king of the underworld. Meanwhile, Luciano called his own council together. Quietly, strategically, they made a decision. Let him have his moment. Let Maranzano think he had won. His arrogance would do most of the work for them. Maranzano thought he was untouchable. He sent out invitations more like royal summons to hundreds of mob leaders from across the country. More than 500 men packed a giant banquet hall on the Grand Concourse in the Bronx. Every seat was assigned, every rank recognized. At the head of the hall sat Maranzano, perched on a massive throne-like chair he had rented from a theatrical prop house. On his right hand, like a medieval prince-in-waiting, sat Charlie Lucky Luciano. The whole joint was practically covered in crosses, another old-timer recalled. Religious pictures, statues of the Virgin, saints I never even heard of. Maranzano was the biggest cross nut in the world. He wore crosses around his neck, kept them in his pockets. Wherever he went, it was like a goddamn cathedral followed him. Maranzano believed religion was everything. He used to bawl his men out for not going to church, even guys who had just pulled a hit. Mike Miranda once told him, "How can I go to church when I just knocked off a guy?" Maranzano just shook his head and said, "That has nothing to do with it. Religion is only concerned with a man's soul." When Maranzano finally stood to speak, the room froze. He spoke in Italian, sometimes slipping into thick Sicilian dialect, quoting Latin, gesturing with grand flourishes. He told the crowd that a new day was dawning. Chicago had tried to stop it, but they had failed. The war was over. Order had been restored. Raising a clenched fist, he proclaimed himself capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses. He explained that there would no longer be separate gangs, no more chaos. Everything would now fall under one banner, his. He would reap a share of all profits and dictate the rules. 5 families would control New York, each with their own territories, their own operations, and their own loyalty. The names were called out: Charlie Lucky Luciano, ruler of the old Masseria faction, and Maranzano's chief lieutenant. Tommy Galliano, who would oversee the remnants of the Rayner crew later becoming the Lucchese crime family, a syndicate that would grow to control gambling operations from New York to Havana to the Dominican Republic, heavily tied to the Trafficante family and Carlos Marcello. Lucchese's daughter would eventually marry Gambino's son, tying the families together in blood. Joe Bonanno, young, hungry, respected by Luciano, but already sowing seeds of distrust. Gambino, Trafficante, and even Chicago hated him. Joe Profaci, an early Luciano loyalist who would later drift toward Genovese when promises of greater riches lured him away. His family would eventually fall into chaos, and, after the dust settled, Joe Colombo would rise a shrewd businessman with ties to Russell Bufalino and Carlo Gambino himself. Vincent Mangano, another old-timer, destined for betrayal. Both he and his brother would eventually be murdered, paving the way for Albert Anastasia, whose own bloodlust would lead to his downfall, and finally, Gambino's ascendancy. Maranzano thought he was writing the history of 1931. In truth, he was writing the history of the 1960s, he just did not know it yet. Maranzano's vision for the new order was as rigid as Roman law. He didn't just want structure, he wanted empire. Each of the 5 families would be headed by a capo, responsible only to Maranzano himself. Beneath the capo, a second-in-command, the underboss would answer solely to the man above him. Then came the lieutenants, each overseeing soldiers grouped in squads of 10, a hierarchy modelled straight out of Caesar's legions. Every man, from the foot soldier to the capo, would answer up the chain, and every man would be held responsible for the actions of the men beneath him. Discipline, Maranzano said. Tight discipline. He repeated it over and over again like a prayer. Discipline would be the cornerstone of the empire. He would be the judge, the priest, the executioner, the supreme arbiter of all disputes, personal or professional, and just as quickly as he gave orders, he promised what would happen to any man who broke them: death. The rules were final. Absolute. No man could speak of the organization not to friends, not to family, not even to his own wife. Orders were to be obeyed without hesitation or question. No member was allowed to strike another, no matter what the insult. All past grievances, old beefs, blood feuds, vendettas were to be buried. Total amnesty. There would be harmony among families, loyalty within them, and no man, no matter how powerful, was allowed to covet another man's business, or his wife. This wasn't just business. It was holy law. At the banquet that followed, the rituals continued. Every man who had been invited, even the ones who couldn't show, had sent representatives to pay tribute to the new order. When Maranzano gave a nod, one by one, envelopes rimming with cash were laid before him. Luciano, years later, remembered the moment clearly. "I give the old man 50 grand in cash myself," he said. And when he added it all up, it came to more than $1 million. But behind the rehearsed smiles and the envelope offerings, a different order was quietly taking shape. What Maranzano failed to see, or refused to acknowledge, was that the very structure he built was already rotting from within. Luciano hadn't forgotten the past, and he sure as hell hadn't forgiven it. Maranzano had humiliated him, tried to sideline him, and now the man who sat at his right hand, the so-called crown prince of the organization, was orchestrating his downfall. Many of the men Maranzano had just appointed the capos. The underbosses weren't his men at all. They were Luciano's, and they were loyal to Charlie Lucky, not the self-proclaimed Caesar of the Bronx. Vito Genovese, Luciano's own underboss, stood ready to move at a moment's notice. His ambition was only matched by his devotion to Luciano, and the same went for the non-Italian brains of the operation, Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, the Jewish partners who didn't care who wore the crown, only who wrote the rules. Tommy Galliano's second in command? That was Tommy Lucchese, Luciano's closest friend. His consigliere. The man who knew every beat of the conspiracy, and another power within Galliano's crew, was Dom the Gap Petrilli, a man who owed everything to Luciano. In the Mangano family, it was even clearer. The underboss was Albert Anastasia, and Anastasia practically worshipped Luciano. He would do whatever Charlie asked, no questions, no hesitation, and standing beside him were Frank Scallis and Carlo Gambino, two men whose patience and cunning were worth more than 100 killers. Even Joe Bonanno, a fellow Sicilian and supposedly one of Maranzano's own kind, felt closer to Luciano. Over the years their bond had grown, and Bonanno, calculating, young and sharp, knew the future lay with the younger generation, not the old guard. The Profaci family. Luciano had allies sprinkled throughout and beyond the families. He had outsiders in his pocket. Dutch Schultz, Louis Lepke, Buchhalter, Silver Dollar Sam, Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, Nucky Johnson in Atlantic City, Santo Trafficante Sr., Stefano Magadino, and Johnny Torrio, the original architect of the National Syndicate. Maranzano thought he was sitting atop a throne, but Luciano had already built a trapdoor beneath it. Even as Maranzano was basking in his new crown, seated high on a throne of borrowed ceremony and old-world arrogance, the foundation beneath him was already cracking. His theatrical speeches, his obsession with Roman structure, his crosses and commandments, they may have impressed the foot soldiers, but they infuriated the leaders. These men hadn't bled during the Castellamarese War, hadn't buried friends and burned through fortunes, just to kneel before another self-appointed dictator. If Maranzano thought they fought for his coronation, he was delusional. They fought for power their own, and now he was in the way. The plot to overthrow the king began almost before his crown was cold. Luciano had made his national connections years earlier at the Atlantic City, meeting a who's who of organized crime, and now he quietly tested those old alliances. He started reaching outside New York, probing to see who else was ready to trade a tyrant for a businessman. Midway through 1931, Luciano hit the road. He took Lansky and Mike Miranda, a trusted gunner, and they drove west, quiet, armed and careful. First stop, the outskirts of Pittsburgh. There, they met Salvatore Calderone, the Sicilian boss of Western Pennsylvania, who'd been present at Maranzano's coronation. Calderone didn't hold back. He was disgusted with Maranzano's grandstanding and pledged his support to Luciano without hesitation. From there, they went to Cleveland, where they met John Scalise, Mo Dalitz, and Frankie Milano, the Mafia's voice in Ohio. Santo Trafficante, loyal and silent, came up from Florida by train. Al Capone even sent a representative from Chicago. Luciano knew this wasn't just about friendship. This was a pitch, and he had to sell it. Even though all these guys was my friends, he recalled later, I still knew I had to stand up in front of them and make sense. They weren't going to risk a full-scale war just because I was talking hot air. So he stood in front of a room of killers and power brokers and gave it to them straight. I told him the old man was nothing but a big tub of horse shit who brought all this Kappa crap over from Sicily, and now he's trying to marry it to Julius Caesar. The room burst into laughter. Luciano knew he had them. I said some of Maranzano's ideas made sense, but they were old-fashioned. I said I'd rather dump 'em in the Atlantic Ocean. They didn't fit no more. He laid out his entire plan, how it would work, why it was better, what came after. He didn't hold back. They had to know we couldn't just dump Maranzano's rules. We had to eliminate him completely. And they agreed. One by one, the men in that room, all roughly Luciano's age, nodded in unison. The plan was set when Luciano made his move on Maranzano. His allies across the country would move at the same time. A full purge. The death of the old world. That night, feeling euphoric, Luciano, Lansky, Miranda, and the Cleveland boys celebrated the way gangsters did. They went to the fights. It was supposed to be a simple night out, a pat on the back before history changed. They didn't even make it through the undercard. A squad of uniformed cops came down the aisle, surrounded them without fuss, and hauled them in on suspicion. They were questioned, booked, and held overnight. The next morning, Luciano said all the right things. We come to see the fights, that's all. They were released and told to get out of town. It was a stupid thing I done in Cleveland, Luciano later said. Could have ruined everything I worked years to build. What we should have done the minute we got there was check in with the cops register, tell 'em we was in town for the fights. I learned from it. After that, any time I traveled, like when I used to go down to Miami, I'd stop by the station before I even unpacked. There was no press coverage, no photos, no headlines. But Maranzano found out. When Luciano got back to New York, he was summoned no request, just a demand to the king's headquarters. He wanted to know what the hell I was doing in Cleveland, Luciano said. So I told him, listen, I went to see the fights with some guys. You know I never miss a good fight. What do I got to do? Check in with you every time I want to take a crap. Maranzano smiled, but something shifted. He offered a backhanded compliment and a veiled threat. By the way, Maranzano said, calm but cold, I never properly expressed my admiration for the way you handled the matter of Don Giuseppe. It was a very good job, Charlie. You should have arranged for me to have pictures of you pulling the trigger. The implication was clear. I know what you did. Luciano, never one to blink, answered with steel. Even if you'd been there with your own camera, or sent God to do it for you, you wouldn't have got no picture of me pulling the trigger. Like the newspapers said I was in the crapper when Joe got it. So, stop jerking off and forget it. The old man froze. Luciano watched his face, the shock, the silence. What I told him gave me a lot of satisfaction, he said. But some little bell went off in my head, telling me I should have kept my mouth shut. And just like that, the countdown began. Luciano had thrown down the gauntlet. Now there was no turning back. For Maranzano, the realization came too late. Luciano wasn't the loyal foot soldier he had imagined. In fact, Luciano and the men closest to him were now the greatest danger to his throne. He moved quickly to protect himself, the way bosses always did when they sensed the sword swinging overhead. Maranzano drew up a hit list, a death sentence. At the top, Luciano, Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, and Joe Adonis, the most dangerous of the Italian Sicilian upstarts. He even widened the scope to include Luciano's non-Italian friends, like Dutch Schultz. But there were some glaring absences. Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel weren't on them. Maranzano apparently saw no threat in them. He also had no idea about the loyalty of men like Tommy Lucchese, Albert Anastasia, or Johnny Torrio. They were invisible in his calculations, and it would cost him dearly. Maranzano, ever the traditionalist, refused to use a made man for the job. He would not break the sacred rules he had just preached to the families. Instead, he went outside. He hired Vincent Mad Dog Coll, a freelance killer, unpredictable, fearless, a lone wolf who would shoot anyone, anywhere, for the right price. It became a race, a deadly countdown to see who would kill first. At first, Luciano, Genovese, and the others had no idea they had been marked. Maranzano was heavily guarded, armored behind his bodyguards, his fortified offices. But Luciano, Costello, Adonis, they lived fast. They moved through clubs and restaurants, exposed, vulnerable. While Maranzano unleashed Mad Dog, Luciano devised a counterattack. He knew that no Italian gunman could get close enough. Maranzano's men would smell a setup from a mile away. To get the old man, Luciano needed outsiders, ghosts. Luckily, Maranzano himself had opened a back door. He had moved his operations into a suite of offices at the Grand Central Building at Park Avenue and 46th Street. His legitimate businesses, real estate, imports, exports, gave him a cover, and regular visitors, like accountants preparing his tax returns, walked in and out unnoticed. Luciano brought the plan to Lansky. "That's the way we get him," Luciano said. "The son of a bitch is so happy to be a taxpayer, he'd invite a treasury agent right in to look at his books." Lansky got to work. He handpicked 3 Jewish gunmen imports from Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Boston, all carefully chosen for their stereotypically Semitic features. To them, Maranzano's guards would see nothing but federal agents. Red Levine loyal, strange, and deadly, and was put in charge. Born in Toledo, Ohio, Red was a contradiction. A devout Jew who always wore a yarmulke at home, a man who draped the talith over his shoulders and prayed before a hit if it fell on the Sabbath. He didn't mix business and religion, he lived both, simultaneously. Lansky rented a house deep in the Bronx. The 4 men were locked inside, isolated, drilled day and night. They learned how to walk, talk, and act like real treasury agents. Food, drink, and women were brought to them, everything they wanted, but no outside contact. Lansky even brought them photographs of Maranzano from every angle, diagrams of his offices. There was no margin for error. Luciano later said they poured $80,000 into the operation, a staggering sum, but he wanted it airtight. As August 1931 bled into September, the situation grew desperate. Frank Costello got a call from Nig Rosen out of Philadelphia. Rosen said he had news, but it was too dangerous to discuss over the phone. Costello made the trip personally. Rosen revealed everything. Maranzano had hired Vincent Coll. He had drawn up a murder list. And worse, the old man's plan was already moving. Maranzano would soon summon Luciano and one of the others for a business meeting. Coll would be waiting for them with no escape. Rosen didn't say exactly how he got the information. He hinted that Angie Caruso, one of Maranzano's trusted underbosses, had been drunk in Philadelphia and got too loose with his mouth. Costello rushed back to New York and delivered the news to Luciano. Luciano moved fast. He ordered Lansky to accelerate the training. The 4 killers needed to be ready to move at any moment. But Vito Genovese had no patience. He demanded action. "Waiting's crazy," Genovese growled. "Let me take care of it. I'll do it myself." Luciano shook his head. "No, Vito. We got time. We wait for the old man to call. We stick to the plan." The call came, right on time. Maranzano's voice was smooth, almost casual. He hadn't seen Charlie Lucky in days, he said, and there were pressing matters to discuss. He wanted Luciano and Vito Genovese to stop by his office the next afternoon, 2 o'clock sharp, to spend the afternoon in conference. As soon as Luciano hung up, he reached for the phone and called Lansky. The code was simple. It was on. That night, the final preparations were made. The murder team rehearsed the plan again and again, running through every detail until it became muscle memory. No mistakes. No second chances. When Luciano was satisfied, he brought in a new face, a muscular, well-dressed man in his 30s. He didn't give a name. He just said, "This man will be in Maranzano's office. He'll finger the target if needed." September 10th, 1931. Just before 2 o'clock, Maranzano was pacing his reception room at the Grand Central Building, nervously waiting. He was expecting Vincent Mad Dog Coll to arrive soon, along with Luciano and Genovese. With him were his secretary, Grace Samuels, and 5 armed bodyguards. The office that day was unusually empty. No hangers-on, no visitors, almost as if Maranzano sensed something. Still, business was business. The door swung open. Tommy Lucchese stepped in an unexpected visitor. It rattled Maranzano immediately. Lucchese was no lightweight. He spoke for Tommy Galliano, a power in the new structure. He took Maranzano's arm, politely but firmly, and steered him toward the inner office. He had, he said, a vital matter to discuss. Before Maranzano could react, the front door opened again. 4 men entered, flashing badges. Federal agents, they said. No one questioned it. Maranzano was under investigation for bootlegging, alien smuggling, tax evasion. His lawyers had even warned him that federal agents might pay a surprise visit. The advice had been simple: be cooperative. Maranzano stood, solemn, and identified himself. That was the moment. One of the agents caught a small nod from Lucchese, a silent signal. Guns came out fast. One agent locked the front door. The others frisked everyone: Maranzano, the secretary, the bodyguards. Weapons were stripped away. Then 2 of the agents shoved Maranzano roughly into his private office. The door shut behind them. No questions were asked. No charges were read. Inside, the 2 men pulled knives, silent weapons for a silent kill, and lunged. Maranzano, for all his age and bulk, fought savagely, throwing punches, crying out. It became a brutal, desperate struggle. Finally, the killers pulled their pistols and pumped 4 rounds into him. When it was over, Maranzano lay sprawled across his desk 6 times, his throat slashed, bullets buried in his head and chest. Blood soaked the fine carpet. The assassins moved quickly. They dashed back into the outer office, regrouped with their 2 partners, and fled down 8 flights of stairs to the street, disappearing into the city like smoke. Behind them, Maranzano's bodyguards fled too, not to fight, but to save themselves. They knew better than to get caught in a room with a corpse. Lucchese lingered for a moment, peering into the office to make sure Maranzano was dead. That was when Bobby Doyle Girolamo Santucci burst in. Doyle, once a prizefighter, had been planted in Maranzano's ranks months earlier, a secret soldier for Luciano. If anything went wrong, Doyle was the backup. But he was late. Lucchese barked at him, "Get out of here." Doyle bolted down the stairs just as police sirens filled the air. He got picked up, questioned briefly, and released. Lucchese, cool as ever, took the elevator down and melted into the crowd on Park Avenue, just another face in the bustling city. At that very moment, Vincent Mad Dog Coll, the hitman Maranzano had hired, was on his way up the stairs. But as he rushed toward the office, he ran into Maranzano's bodyguards fleeing the scene. One of them gave him the news. Maranzano was dead. Coll had $25,000 in his pocket and an advance he would never have to earn, and nobody to refund it to. He turned around and left. 5 months later, Coll would fall himself, gunned down in a Manhattan telephone booth, a casualty of his own bloody feud with Dutch Schultz. Back downtown, Luciano, Genovese, and the others waited in sweaty silence for confirmation. Just before 3 o'clock, it came. A call to Frank Costello from the 53rd Street precinct. A second call came minutes later from Red Levine. The radio confirmed the rest. Luciano sent out the word, the boss was dead. But the second wave that coordinated assassinations across the country was called off. Luciano explained it later. Plenty of people got eliminated before the day Maranzano got his. But all that stuff them writers wrote about the night of the Sicilian Vespers, that was pure imagination. Every time somebody writes about it, the list gets bigger and bigger. Last count I read, 50 guys. But the funny thing, nobody could ever name one top guy who got hit that night. It wasn't necessary. We told him the truth. Maranzano's death was to stop the killing, not start more. The only confirmed victim tied to that fabled night was Gerardo Scarpato, the owner of the Nuova Villa Tamaro restaurant at Coney Island, who was murdered in the dark hours following Maranzano's fall. The old world had died in a pool of blood. The new world, Luciano's world, had just been born. When Salvatore Maranzano was assassinated, it wasn't just a hit. It was a signal that the old world had been buried for good, and the men who carried it out weren't random trigger pullers. They were trained killers, hand-picked and groomed by Meyer Lansky, and one of the most enigmatic Jewish figures in organized crime, Red Levine. Red wasn't just another thug. He was Luciano's most trusted enforcer, a man who drove, killed, and stood beside Charlie Lucky when it mattered most. Luciano used to say, "I trust Lansky with my money, but I trust Red with my life." Red Levine was a paradox, a devout Orthodox Jew, a man who followed his religion to the letter, but who would pick up a gun or a knife the moment permission was granted. He never killed for pleasure. He killed for principle, especially when the target showed even a hint of anti-Semitism. And when he got the green light from Luciano, he never missed. Luciano loved him. So did Russell Bufalino. Lucchese respected him, and Gambino knew his name. Even Joe Bonanno, who couldn't stand him, acknowledged the power he carried. Because everyone in the American underworld knew one thing. When you shook Red Levine's hand, you were shaking the hand of the man who killed Maranzano. But Carlo Gambino saw the killing differently. When Lucchese told him what had happened, how 4 Jewish gunmen posing as federal agents entered the Grand Central building, how Maranzano was stabbed and shot, how Red had personally ensured the job was finished, Gambino just stared at him. And in a voice that was soft, almost disappointed, he asked, "As a Sicilian, couldn't you have done it yourself? Why leave it to a bunch of Jew killers?" Lucchese didn't answer directly. He didn't have to. This was America now. The rules were different. Gambino was from the old world, but he was no fool. He hadn't lived through the old street wars, the brutal fights between the Italians, the Jews, and the Irish. But he was watching something new rise in front of him. An emerging underworld alliance, a multi-ethnic empire fueled by shared power, not heritage. It was the 1930s and Dutch Schultz was setting the city on fire. He was going to war in Harlem and Brooklyn, trying to muscle out the black community for control of the numbers racket. The truth was that Schultz and Luciano's crew didn't invent the racket. The black and Spanish communities had run it for years, betting small, taking risks, dodging cops. It was chaotic, limited. Most people had to know a guy, and bookies were picky. Some didn't even take certain bets because they didn't trust the odds. That's where Luciano, Lansky, Dutch, Lucchese, Genovese, Costello, and even young Gambino came in. They took that chaos and turned it into a system. They built a national betting service, tied to the racing wire, and embedded it into everyday life. You could walk into your local grocery store and place a bet. You could sit in a barber chair, call out your number, and walk out with fresh hair and fresh odds. The cops were paid off. The odds were fair. The payouts were real. Luciano's group controlled it all, and Gambino was learning how the pieces fit. He didn't just watch. He invested. He became a financier, a silent partner in these growing empires, and through those investments, he got closer to the machinery, then began taking it over. Meanwhile, Dutch Schultz was spinning out of control. The money from his numbers racket and his union rackets made him one of the richest men in New York. But his ego was poisoning everything. He clashed with too many gangsters. He made too many enemies. It was only a matter of time. Luciano saw it. Lucchese saw it, and Gambino saw it too. When Dutch finally got clipped, not a single Jewish gangster inherited his empire. Everything was passed to the Italians. The spoils were divided among Genovese, Lucchese, Frank Scalise, and Joe Adonis. And those men pointed to one man to run the operation: Carlo Gambino. He was tasked with managing the rackets, working with the black community, and most importantly, understanding them. Gambino didn't just want to make money. He wanted votes. If it meant giving the black community a cut of a racket, that was fine as long as they voted for the politicians Gambino backed. He knew the deal. In return for money, protection, and access to unions. He wanted loyalty, street power, and a say in who got elected, and he delivered. If they needed heroin, Gambino could source it. If they wanted in on the numbers, he'd set them up. If they wanted muscle for a union takeover, he'd lend them soldiers. All he asked for in return was allegiance. After Maranzano's death, there were rackets to be taken, power to be redistributed, and one of the most valuable assets up for grabs was the alien smuggling routes. Maranzano had built the network that brought in thousands of Sicilian loyalists, invisible laborers, foot soldiers, and contract killers. These men didn't come for the American dream. They came to work for the mob. They were stashed on the docks, put to work in sweatshops, gambling dens, smuggling rings. If the unions got loud or dared to strike, these were the men who showed up with bats, chains, or worse. They were ghosts, and big business welcomed them. No identifications, no questions, just results. They were paid in scraps, but the ones pulling the strings got rich. Gambino didn't create that system. But after Maranzano's fall, he inherited it, and he made it his own. He had watched Luciano remove a king. He had seen how business was done in the New World, and now he was playing the game himself quietly, patiently, and with absolute focus. After Maranzano's death, a new kind of empire began to grow across America. It was an empire unlike anything the old Sicilian bosses could have imagined, an empire built not on bloodlines, but on business. The Irish, the Jews, and the Italians groups that once fought tooth and nail for the same corners started coming together, forging uneasy alliances, and out of that unholy union, a new kind of corruption began to spread like wildfire across the country. At the heart of it all was a new power structure, a national network, a machine. Some of the most dangerous hitters from the Jewish underworld, men like Lepke Buchhalter, Dutch Schultz, Longid Zwilman, and Irving Blitz, now worked hand in glove with Luciano's Italian crews, Joe Adonis, Frank Scalise, the Mangano brothers, Vito Genovese, and the one and only Albert Anastasia. Together they controlled the New York docks. They controlled the streets. They controlled everything that moved, and deep in the shadows, Anastasia's real army was forming a secret department of death known to a few as Murder Incorporated. The roster was terrifying. Lepke, Dutch, dozens of others. Cold-blooded professional killers sold their loyalty to the highest bidder inside Luciano's new underworld. Their mission was simple: eradicate threats. Not just gangsters, but witnesses, businessmen, journalists, politicians, even police officers. Thousands of bodies piled up across America, most undiscovered, most unsolved, and most connected to this invisible murder machine. In Luciano's new world, if you wanted someone dead, it was handled through Murder Inc. under the watchful eye of Anastasia. But Anastasia wasn't an emperor yet. He still needed permission. If he wanted someone whacked, he had to clear it through Luciano, Costello, or Adonis. Most hits needed the green light, at least officially. Some, though, slipped through without permission, because nobody dared stand up to Albert Anastasia. They ruled the docks with an iron fist, and when you controlled the docks, you controlled everything: the cargo, the shipments, the invisible flow of goods and money, and Carlo Gambino. Ever the patient student watched it all. He learned from it. He saw the real game. Gambino wasn't the first to play the smuggling racket. He was a product of it. During the First World War, young Gambino had been trafficked into America, smuggled across the Atlantic, a ghost on a crowded ship. Everybody along the way had been bribed to look the other way. When he arrived, he was taken in by the Castellano family, given a place, given a purpose. Now, years later, Gambino wanted control. He understood that alien smuggling, would be the key to owning not just the docks, but the rackets, the numbers, the narcotics, and he wasn't alone. Across Europe, especially in Italy and Sicily, chaos was exploding. Mussolini was on the rise, and mobsters were fleeing Sicily in droves. Gambino had been part of the first wave, but he would not be the last. Maranzano, despite all his flaws, had seen the opportunity. He built a valuable smuggling network, bringing thousands of mobsters and soldiers into New York. They became foot soldiers for the new underworld, answering one boss and one boss only. They were invisible puppets, tools to be used and discarded at will. When Luciano took out Maranzano, he inherited that network, and eventually, piece by piece, it would fall into the hands of Carlo Gambino. During the Great Depression, when America was starving and broken, Gambino watched as the waterfront became a battlefield. These immigrant soldiers were unleashed to run rackets, break unions, smuggle dope, strong-arm businessmen, silence witnesses. Big business turned a blind eye, happy to let organized crime handle dirty work they couldn't be seen touching. Paperwork didn't matter. Citizenship didn't matter. Results mattered. These men worked the docks for pennies. They were expendable. But to Gambino and his crew, they were pure power muscle in plain sight. The truth was, the operation never ended. It just evolved. It still exists today, hidden under new flags and new names. When Gambino saw Luciano take out Maranzano, he nodded quietly. It wasn't approval. It was understanding. He was learning the art, the blueprint. How you moved quietly, how you built loyalty, how you crushed your enemies not with noise, but with precision. By 1932, Gambino had carved out his place in Brooklyn. He was respected by Luciano. He was trusted by Frank Scalise. He was working hand in glove with Tommy Lucchese. The unions, the gambling rackets, the loan sharking, the real estate scams, the political machines, Gambino had his fingerprints on all of it. He helped Luciano expand the racing wire across New York, building a communications network that funneled millions into the mob's pockets. By the time 1932 was over, Gambino was no longer a soldier. He was a captain. He answered to Philip and Vincent Mangano, but everyone knew the brains behind the operation were Joe Adonis and Albert Anastasia, two men wired directly to Luciano. The tentacles of power kept stretching. Into Pennsylvania, where Stefano Magaddino ruled. Into the Midwest, the South, even Havana, and through it all, quietly, steadily, without ever needing the spotlight, Carlo Gambino was weaving his own empire, one that would, in time, swallow them all. Luciano was no fool. By the mid-1930s, he wasn't just the most powerful mafia boss in America, he was the architect of a new era. Every major crime family in New York had ties to him, directly or through the men he trusted most. Let's start with his own family. The Luciano family. At his right hand was Frank Costello, the political magician. If Luciano ran the streets, Costello ran City Hall. He was the ultimate fixer, a man who could deliver politicians like pizzas, who greased judges, cops, unions, even whole city agencies with a smile and a handshake. When he introduced Lucky to someone new, Luciano was almost giddy like a schoolboy. "Every time Frank brought me a new guy," he once said, "I damn near tripped over my own feet." Then there was Joe Adonis, another political insider, who helped steer Luciano's empire through New York's business world. With Costello and Adonis at his side, Lucky had influence over transportation hubs, waterfront operations, gambling parlors, union halls, and entire city contracts. The policy rackets, the casinos, the loan sharking, and even the real estate deals, all of it kicked up to Luciano, and behind the scenes, managing the money like a Wall Street broker in a fedora, was the real genius, Meyer Lansky. Lansky wasn't just an accountant. He was the engine that kept the money moving, the man who reinvested Luciano's millions, cleaned the dirty money, and turned short-cons into long-term fortunes. While the elites of the Depression era hoarded their cash, the Mafia reinvested, buying everything from nightclubs and casinos to trucking companies and waterfront businesses. They weren't just building rackets. They were buying chunks of the US economy. Every time they funneled money into a business, be it narcotics, human trafficking, the numbers, the speakeasies, or prostitution, they also bought influence. Judges, mayors, police brass. The mob was funding the very politicians who would later claim to fight them. Joe Bonanno, one of the youngest bosses on the scene, owed his seat at the table to both Luciano and Maranzano. He idolized Maranzano, respected Lucky, and always received what he needed from them. But Lucky saw him. He knew Bonanno's weakness, his loyalty to a dead man's ghost, his blind admiration for Maranzano. Tommy Galliano, by contrast, was rock solid, quiet, efficient, loyal to the core. Lucky respected him immensely. His underboss, Tommy Lucchese, was arguably Luciano's most trusted lieutenant. In the Mangano family there was tension. Vincent Mangano was old school, a hardliner who believed in titles, tradition, and Sicilian honor. But inside his own family were men whose true loyalty was to Luciano. Albert Anastasia, the mad executioner. Frank Scalise, Lucky's wartime advisor and lifelong ally. Carlo Gambino, the quiet observer, the man who played chess while the rest were brawling with brass knuckles. Gambino protected the assets of Anastasia, Scalise, and Adonis. He was the shadow behind their muscle, ensuring that operations ran smoothly, profits flowed, and tempers stayed in check. It's often said that Joe Adonis was part of Mangano's family. Luciano didn't dispute it, but he clarified. Adonis might have had a piece of Mangano, but Adonis, he was mine. Still, Adonis had his flaws. He was loud, flashy. He blew money on suits, women, and gambling like there was no tomorrow. He took care of his family, sure, but he spent the rest on the night. That lifestyle caught up to him in the 1950s, when his name became too big, his habits too visible. Then there was Anastasia, the wild card. Luciano loved him but never fully trusted him. Anastasia didn't just kill rivals. He murdered civilians, shot union officials without clearance, and acted on impulse. He respected Lucky, but sometimes Lucky looked at him and wondered if he was even sane. Inside this powerful syndicate, Gambino played it smart. He kept his head down. He never made waves. He handled issues quietly, going first to Frank Scalise or Tommy Lucchese, who would then bring matters to Lucky himself. Mangano hated this. It undermined his authority that felt more like a house of cards than solid concrete. The truth was, Luciano, Costello, and Anastasia didn't need Vincent Mangano. They had survived together in the trenches, killed for each other, made fortunes together. They didn't answer anyone, especially not Mangano. But Mangano still controlled the Brooklyn waterfront, the heart of his empire. And for that, he needed muscle like Anastasia, brains like his brother Philip Mangano, and political clout, with the International Longshoremen's Association. It was Vincent Mangano's territory, the Brooklyn piers, the ships, the cargo. How did a mob boss make money from the waterfront? Extortion, theft, blood. If a ship wanted to dock, they paid tribute. If cargo was to be loaded or unloaded, the price was steep. The dock workers, poor Sicilians and southern Italians living in Red Hook and Sheepshead Bay, paid daily fees just to work. Union dues on top. Protection money on top of that. And if a worker fell behind. There was always a Shylock ready with a loan at 30% interest. Refused to pay. You were dropped in the hold. You were thrown to the sharks. Literally. If you talked to the cops, your body disappeared. Cargo was stolen. Ship captains were extorted, and every box that passed through the docks, whiskey, weapons, narcotics, was either taxed or taken. It was chaos, and Carlo Gambino watched it all. He studied Mangano's operations, especially how political corruption protected it all, the officials, the captains, the freight companies. Gambino knew that if he wanted to rise, he'd need to understand not just the docks, but the politics behind them. Meanwhile, he ran the liquor racket. Unlike others, Gambino saw the end of prohibition not as a setback, but an opportunity. While most mobsters got out of the bootlegging game, Gambino doubled down. He bought more stills, more equipment, everything at a discount. By 1934, he owned a virtual monopoly on high-proof moonshine from New York to Maryland. He made more money after Prohibition than he ever had before. At 30 years old, Gambino was rich enough to marry his first cousin, Catherine Castellano, and to bring his two brothers, Paolo and Giuseppe, out of Mussolini's fascist Italy. He Americanized their names, Paul and Joe, and he put them to work in his Borgata. Albert Anastasia wasn't just the underboss of the Mangano crime family. He was the executioner-in-chief of the American underworld, the man whose word turned whispers into funerals, whose name alone could send tremors down a Brooklyn pier. Long before it had a name, Murder Incorporated was his domain. Created in 1931 by Lucky Luciano, this was not just another hit squad. It was a separate machine, a blood-slick cog designed to carry out contract killings outside the traditional family structure, so the bosses could keep their hands and their records clean. At the top was Luciano. Below him, Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello signed off on the targets, and then came the enforcers. Abe Relays, Red Levine, Charlie the Bug Workman, Louis Lepke Buchalter, and Albert Anastasia, a Jewish labor racketeer and a Calabrian butcher of men. Their headquarters was Midnight Roses, a 24-hour candy store in Brownsville East, New York, where killers sat in booths chewing penny candy and waiting for contracts like they were waiting for coffee refills. They were on salary $200 a week for their loyalty and silence. They didn't freelance. They didn't ask questions. They got the file. They memorized the target. They killed and they went home. Anastasia, with his black curls, dark skin, and a stare that could freeze a freight train, was not just the boss. He was the myth. To some, he was the Mad Hatter. To others, the Lord High Executioner. In whispers, they called him Earthquake. Because when he entered a room, people trembled. When he entered a room, people died. Born in Calabria, a region soaked in blood and vendettas, Albert came to America with brothers. One became a priest. Another, Anthony Tough Tony Anastasio, became the most feared union leader on the Brooklyn docks, vice president of the International Longshoremen's Association, head of Local 1814, and Albert's silent partner in power. Tony wasn't a made guy. He didn't need to be. Every man on the waterfront knew his last name. That was enough. Together, Albert and Tony Anastasia ruled the Brooklyn waterfront like a fiefdom. The dock workers, many of them Sicilian or Calabrian immigrants, bent their backs and kept their mouths shut. They paid to work, paid to eat, paid to stay alive. Anyone who stepped out of line, buried in a lime pit in Ohio, dumped in a chicken yard in Jersey. Ask Peter Panto. He tried to organize. Now he's fertilizer. You didn't rebel against the Anastasias. Not unless you were ready to die with your boots on. Picture the scene. A grey dawn over Brooklyn, longshoremen hunched in frigid wind, and through the mist Albert Anastasia striding the docks like a general, his machine-gun voice barking at foremen, cracking like a whip, his chest out, his eyes dead. Behind him, like a shadow in silk, comes tough Tony White carnation, white tie, custom double-breasted suit gleaming under the dockside haze, diamond cufflinks, Broadway girl on his arm the night before, Cadillac waiting at the curb. They were gods. The Mafia's Cain and Abel, and in the late 1930s, no man in Cosa Nostra was feared more than Albert Anastasia. He didn't just run rackets. He institutionalized homicide. He was judge, jury, and executioner in a system where death was the final contract, and he had the pen. Organized crime evolves like a predator in the wild, always adapting, always moving, always surviving. And by the early 1930s, Carlo Gambino was quietly becoming part of that evolution. Where the old-school gangsters swung baseball bats, Gambino was learning to swing votes. It was 1932, and Tommy Lucchese, who understood better than anyone that real power came with a handshake, not a gun, tasked his young protege with a mission. Start working on the politicians, the judges, the delegates. Brooklyn's got a whole lot more than dock workers, it's got votes, and we're going to need all of them. What Lucchese proposed wasn't a crime. It was a blueprint, a plan that mirrored the sit-down Johnny Torrio had years earlier with Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, and Meyer Lansky, a moment that changed the American underworld forever. Torrio's idea was simple. Forget small-time rackets. Take over everything. The booze, the unions, the ports, the betting, the businesses, and most importantly, the ballots. Now the same concept was being reborn in Brooklyn. Gambino would be the apprentice. Lucchese, the architect and helping behind the scenes, were the masters themselves. Costello, Luciano, and Anastasia, especially with his grip on the ILA, the International Longshoremen's Association. Brooklyn was more than a borough. It was a political war zone, and one that could be weaponized. The Depression had crippled cities, emptied banks, and left businesses bleeding. But for the Mafia, it was open season. While America starved, the syndicates were flush with cash, ready to buy influence at every level. The goal now was simple: control Brooklyn's political machine, and from there, control everything else. Gambino understood this instinctively. In Italy, he had watched as Mussolini's regime rose to power, not just with soldiers, but with control of the vote. When the masses were handed ballots, the power shifted from force to influence, from thuggery to strategy. Brooklyn had it all: the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, the American Labor Party, even the Communist Party. The borough was a patchwork of ethnic blocs, political machines, and ideological factions, and every one of them could be bought, borrowed, or broken. That's where Frank Costello came in. Costello wasn't just making backroom deals. He was rooming with Tammany Hall delegates at the 1932 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. He shook hands with the men who picked mayors and moved judges like chess pieces. He made promises, collected debts, and slowly started building an empire that ran parallel to City Hall itself. Tammany Hall was the engine. Costello had the keys, and by the 1940s, he was pulling strings on behalf of men like William O'Dwyer, the mayor of New York City, a man who owed everything to Costello's political machine. In Brooklyn, the Mafia's influence grew darker and deeper. One target was Hyman Shorenstein, a long-time Democratic boss with a grip on local politics. But when the Mafia wanted him gone. They didn't use bullets, they used ballots. They staged a quiet campaign of massive illegal voting, rigging the numbers with hundreds of fake votes. It was elegant, effective, and almost invisible. And he was gone. The power vacuum was filled with mob-controlled candidates, backed by people like John McCooey, the chairman of the Kings County Democratic Party, a man who would go on to join the Democratic National Committee in 1932. That was the level Gambino now operated on. Not street level. National. Henry Hesterberg, the Brooklyn Borough President from 1930 to 1933, and Erwin Steingut, who held a seat in the State Assembly for years, were all part of this interwoven game. Both served as delegates to Democratic National Conventions for decades, and both were watched closely by men like Costello and Gambino, who needed political access just as badly as they needed access to narcotics, shipping lines, and vote-rich union halls. By controlling the ports, they controlled jobs. By controlling the jobs, they controlled the unions, and by controlling the unions, they controlled elections. Brooklyn's 5 Democratic seats, the 2 held by the Labour Party, the lone city fusion seat, even the Communist Party's solitary vote, it was all information, all data, all leverage. It was no longer about rackets and muscle. It was about strategy, access and domination. And as Gambino quietly took his place in the background, learning the machinery of political power from Lucchese, Costello and Luciano, he knew that controlling Brooklyn wasn't just about docks and cargo anymore. It was about votes, judges, contracts and influence that lasted decades. Evolution in the underworld comes only when the predator is threatened. And by 1932, the environment was shifting. The Mafia had spent a decade learning how to dominate the streets, hijacking trucks, bribing judges, fixing unions, but now they were stepping into a world that moved far slower and far more dangerously than the streets. American politics. Carlo Gambino, still the quiet observer in the background, was absorbing the lesson in real time. He had already been assigned by Tommy Lucchese to start feeling out delegates, district leaders, local judges, anyone who could help deliver votes and protection. The goal wasn't just domination, it was legitimacy. It was the same strategy Johnny Torrio had pitched years earlier to Luciano, Lansky and Costello. Take the gangster game and corporatize it. Turn it into a national conglomerate of power and vice, all protected by suits and courtrooms. By the time of the Great Depression, the Mafia was sitting on mountains of cash, surrounded by a country that was flat broke. Opportunity dripped from the gutters. But as organized crime clawed its way into Tammany Hall, into New York City courts, into the veins of every labor union and port authority, they failed to realize that the establishment had its own predators, and they were older, wealthier, and far more ruthless. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was watching all of it, and he wasn't going to let gangsters control the Democratic vote in his own backyard. He needed Tammany Hall, yes, but he wasn't going to beg for their support. He was going to walk in with leverage, with scandal and subpoenas in hand. He would bring his own dogs to heel the Mafia, Judge Samuel Seabury and the Hofstadter Committee. That's when things changed. That's when Luciano crapped himself. He had seen power. He had taste control. But now, for the first time, he was facing a different enemy, not a rival gangster with guns and muscle, but a statesman with laws, hearings, and headlines. The newspapers were filled with scandal. The word racketeer was being whispered not in alleyways, but in the halls of Albany and Washington. The Seabury investigations, launched in 1930, began as a probe into magistrates' courts. It looked dry on the surface: judicial reform, court consolidation. But behind the doors, it was blood sport. Over 1,000 witnesses were called in private. 300 more testified publicly. Judges, vice cops, prosecutors, all of them caught framing innocent women as prostitutes, taking bribes, running protection for vice dens, burying cases. Seabury had one goal: Pull the curtain back on the whole rotten system. And behind that curtain was the Mafia. The Mafia had grown fat off prohibition, feeding politicians with millions in bribes, laundering money through union kickbacks, buying election influence one district at a time. Wall Street was rigged, judges were bought, DAs were compromised, and Roosevelt, playing the long game, let the crooks chase the crooks. When Joseph Kennedy, a man who had made his own fortune bootlegging and stock market manipulation, was tapped by Roosevelt to crack down on Wall Street, it wasn't irony, it was design. "You need a crook to catch a crook," Joseph Kennedy himself said, and Kennedy knew them all. But even he paled next to the surgical precision of Samuel Seabury. By 1932, the probe reached the top, and Mayor Jimmy Walker found himself in Seabury's crosshairs. The investigators pulled bank records, traced letters of credit used to buy city bus franchises, and even unearthed a mysterious tin box, supposedly filled with bribe cash, stashed in a joint safe deposit box under Walker's name and that of his financial agent, Russell Sherwood. Sherwood conveniently vanished to Mexico. Walker made jokes during the hearings. But Seabury wasn't playing games. He dragged the mayor through days of public testimony, tore down every excuse, exposed every scandal. The press had a field day. Roosevelt, by now governor of New York, prepared to rule on the mayor's fate. But before he could issue the final order, Walker resigned. And in that moment, December 1932, the Mafia felt a frigid wind blow through their empire. This wasn't a rival gang. This wasn't a power struggle in Brooklyn. This was the federal government, and it had just tasted blood. Luciano, Costello, Lansky, all of them knew the game had changed. The streets they ruled were no longer safe because the battlefield had shifted. The real war was now in city halls, courthouses, and congressional hearings. Gambino understood this faster than most. While others scrambled, he kept his head down, studying the map of this new war, a war where the aristocrats fought with legislation, not bullets, and their soldiers wore robes instead of trench coats. In the grim winter of 1932, America was on its knees. The crash of '29 had emptied bank vaults and bread baskets alike, and now it was starving people and suffocating hope. Wall Street was still standing, but no one believed in it anymore. The president, Herbert Hoover, clung to office like a man dangling off a ledge. Everyone, even his own party, knew the fall was coming. By spring, the country wasn't just crying for change, it was screaming, and in the smoke-filled rooms of the Claridge Hotel, the underworld listened. Luciano, Costello, Lansky, the architects of modern organized crime, sat across from each other, with their shoes polished, their suits pressed, and their eyes on the biggest racket of all, the White House. In politics, Luciano later said, it was like craps. When the numbers hit, nobody touches the dice. But when it's snake eyes and boxcars, you flush the whole game. Hoover? He was boxcars. The whole country was ready to throw him down the toilet. That's why the bosses met. To decide who'd get their backing when the Democrats rolled into Chicago. It was down to three: John Nance Garner of Texas, Al Smith of New York, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the smiling patrician from Hyde Park. Garner they didn't trust. Too much cowboy, too much Hearst. Smith, they knew. Roosevelt, he was the wild card. Luciano had a soft spot for Smith. Not just because they were both street kids from the same borough, but because Smith had earned his bones with the party. He'd taken the hits, done the time. The guy was loyal. But Smith had baggage. Catholic, defeated and fading, and Roosevelt? Roosevelt was catching fire. Luciano got the call at the Waldorf. "This the Mr. Luciano?" the voice asked. "Yeah," he said. "Who's calling?" "Please hold. The Cardinal would like a word." Cardinal Dougherty of Philadelphia. Holy mackerel. Said the Vatican wouldn't mind if he did a little quiet campaigning. reminded Luciano that backing Smith wasn't just politics, it was faith. I said, "Well, Cardinal, I'm a Catholic too," and he cuts me off, laughing. Says, "But you're not a very good one, are you, my son?" Luciano chuckled. I told him he had me, but I gave him my word I'd help Smith. He thanked me and said, "Maybe visit St. Patrick's sometime." I told him, "Don't hold your breath." Still, the call rattled Luciano. He didn't trust Roosevelt, not the way Costello did. "There's something in my bones," he told Frank and Maya. "I don't trust that guy. He talks like he came out of Harvard, not Hell's Kitchen." Costello waved him off. "Charlie, Roosevelt wants to be president so bad he'll kiss your ass in Macy's window if it'll help him." That didn't mean they weren't cautious. Roosevelt needed New York's delegates, and in 1932, that meant Tammany Hall and Tammany Hall. That meant Luciano and Costello. But Seabury was the problem. Judge Samuel Seabury was digging up every dirty dollar in New York politics. Walker, Hines, Dutch, Lepke, even Luciano himself. Every day, new headlines. Every week, another hearing. It was getting too hot. "We put together over $2 million in cash," Luciano recalled. "Tried to buy Seabury off. Told him to take a vacation. Let things cool down. The bastard turned us down flat and gave the story to the fucking Times. Next morning, we're front page." The only guy who could leash Seabury was Roosevelt. So the mob sat tight. They had the delegates. They had leverage. They just needed the play. Then it came. Quietly. In Peacock Alley, a lawyer from Tuxedo Park dropped a line at Costello's table. "I wanted to meet." "We sat down like businessmen," Luciano said. "Everybody knew what the other guy wanted. We didn't gotta say it." The lawyer danced. "We're looking for supporters of the governor's campaign." Costello smiled. "We've never held back from our friends. If he gets the nomination, the door's open." Luciano didn't like dancing. "Let's stop the bullshit. Roosevelt's got this guy Seabury making trouble. You want help? Then you help us, and we want a sign. Now." The deal was struck, and the convention loomed. Tammany split in two. Jimmy Hines went for Roosevelt. Al Marinelli stayed with Smith. The game was on. Roosevelt made a statement, one that only Luciano and Costello really understood. He praised Seabury's efforts, but said there wasn't enough evidence to move on Walker, Hines, or Tammany Hall. That was the sign. Costello was ecstatic. "What did I tell you, Charlie?" he shouted. "This guy will sell anything, buy anything. He wants it that bad." Luciano wasn't sold. "I don't know, Frank. Smith's one of us. Roosevelt's from that world where guys like us ain't even allowed in the club." Costello nodded. "Yeah, but being in the club don't mean nothing. Winning does." Meyer Lansky saw it differently. "What if they cancel each other out?" he asked. "We hold out till the last second, tip the scale. That's how we own the odds." Despite his instincts, he wasn't ready to write Roosevelt off, at least not yet. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was still a mystery to many in 1932. Sure, he had a resume, Assistant Secretary of the Navy under President Wilson during the Great War, a failed vice presidential candidate in that doomed 1920 campaign, a man who'd battled polio and returned to the national stage just in time to nominate Al Smith in 24 before climbing his way into the governor's mansion. But Roosevelt's reputation was more myth than substance. People admired his patrician charm, the easy grin and the quiet courage he wore like a tailored suit. But beyond that, he was foggy. A man wrapped in aura, not in action. As spring gave way to summer in 1932, Roosevelt's people hit the ground running. They fanned out across the country like an army of traveling salesmen, hustling delegates for the nomination. By the time the Democratic National Convention in Chicago loomed on the calendar, Roosevelt had the numbers, or so it seemed. He had a clear majority. But the rules were different back then. This wasn't horseshoes. You didn't win by getting close. Roosevelt needed 2/3 of the delegates to clinch the nomination, and that last slice wouldn't come easy. The holdouts mattered, and none more than New York, especially New York City. Upstate was already in his pocket, but the 5 boroughs were another story. That was Tammany Hall territory. That was Al Smith's backyard, and Smith still had juice. If Roosevelt wanted the nomination, he had to go through Tammany, and in 1932, Tammany was run by 2 men, Frank Costello and Charlie Lucky Luciano. There wasn't a chance in hell Roosevelt could get the delegates from the city without making a deal with Tammany, Luciano recalled years later, the smirk practically visible in his voice. And in 32, Tammany was me and Frank. He admitted something else too, something that still carried weight decades later. I had a funny feeling about Roosevelt, Luciano said. Yeah, I liked Al Smith. He was our guy. But Smith didn't talk no better than me. Sounded like the Lower East Side come alive. And I hated the idea of a guy like that running the country. I thought maybe Roosevelt had the edge. I respected him. He came from that world. Palm Beach, Saratoga, the swells. I got to know that crowd. They were educated. They didn't blink at money. But deep down, something in my bones told me not to trust Roosevelt. When Luciano aired his doubts to Costello and Meyer Lansky, they laughed in his face. Charlie, Costello told him, you don't know what the hell you're talking about. I deal with these politicians every day, more than you ever will. Roosevelt wants to be president so bad he'd kiss your ass in Macy's window if it'd help him. They knew Roosevelt would have to come crawling to Tammany eventually, and when he did, they'd be ready. They already had their price. But there was a problem. Tammany was burning. The stench of corruption in New York City had reached a point where it couldn't be ignored any longer. Mayor Jimmy Walker, one of their own, was practically dripping in scandal, and the man turning over the rocks was no flunky. It was Judge Samuel Seabury, an old-school Democrat and one-time enemy of Tammany, who'd once been knifed out of a gubernatorial run by the same machine he now hunted. Seabury was relentless. Every morning brought new headlines. Walker, the cops, the judges, the courts, all rotten with bribes and kickbacks. Luciano and Costello were in the thick of it, right alongside Dutch Schultz, Lepke Buchhalter, Jimmy Hines, and half the political elite of the city. Every goddamn fucking move we made was ending up in the papers, Luciano later griped. Seabury was digging deep, into our deals with the judges, into everything. He was making it look like we were all tied up in one big dirty package. Me, Costello, Schultz, Jimmy Walker, Jimmy Hines, all of us. You couldn't open the papers in 31 or early 32 without seeing another scandal Seabury was exposing. The heat was getting hotter and fast. If Seabury didn't back off, their business would start to bleed and worse. Some of them might actually do time. Schultz, Vito, maybe even Luciano and Costello themselves. So, they tried the old-fashioned way. They raised over $2 million in cash, real money, even for them, and offered it to Seabury to take a long vacation, maybe disappear for a while. Let the storm pass. Seabury told them to go to hell. Not only did he turn them down cold, he leaked the bribe to the New York Times. Front page. Again. That left one option. Roosevelt. The only guy who could control Seabury was Roosevelt, Luciano admitted. And that's where we thought we had our ace. We had most of the city's delegates in our pocket. We could stop the governor from taking New York, and if he couldn't win his own state, he'd look like a bum. That could kill his nomination, right there. So they waited, quietly, strategically, knowing Roosevelt would have to come to them, and when he did, the price would be more than votes. It would be power. Chicago, June 1932. The heat clung to the streets like a second skin, and inside the Drake Hotel, the real politics of America were being decided. not by speeches or ballots, but by whispered deals in silk-lined suites. Lucky Luciano arrived with Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky as part of the New York delegation, but they weren't just there for appearances. They were the invisible architects, shadowing every move of the Democratic Party's top brass, pulling levers behind the curtain like seasoned vaudevillians. Luciano commandeered a lavish six-room suite, a palace in miniature, and shared it with Al Marinelli, his old friend from Tammany Hall and a staunch supporter of Al Smith. Across the hotel, Frank Costello occupied an equally opulent space, joined by Jimmy Hines, another Tammany warhorse, but this one in Roosevelt's camp, and in between them, fittingly and literally, was Meyer Lansky, the broker, the mediator, the quiet man with the loudest reach, ready to entertain and negotiate with anyone worth a handshake or a future favor. Elsewhere in the hotel, bouncing between rooms and bars, was Abner Longy Zwillman, Jersey's quiet storm. He had wrangled a block of delegates from Nassau County and northern New Jersey, making sure none of them wandered too far from the party line, or from the party favors. It wasn't a convention. It was a coronation masquerading as chaos. Chicago was on fire with energy. The last week of June felt more like New Year's Eve, or the night before the Volstead Act took hold. No one pretended to obey prohibition, not here. The liquor flowed like Lake Michigan had sprung a leak. Delegates could buy whiskey on any corner from vendors tied to Al Capone's old crew. 6 weeks earlier, Capone had been hauled off on tax charges, but his men were still running the show. Jake Guzik, Tony Accardo, and Charlie Fischetti, Al's real cousin, made sure the booze didn't stop, and neither did the security. Accardo, not yet the big tuna, was already holding court as an enforcer of mythic proportion, and he didn't just provide the liquor, he provided protection. Rings of uniformed cops, all bought and paid for, formed a living barrier around the power centers of the convention. It was here, amid the clink of ice and the murmurs of deals, that futures were being stitched together. Some of those present would shape organized crime for the next half-century. One of the biggest drinkers and operators was Huey Long, the kingfish from Louisiana. His voice boomed, his ego larger than any ballroom chandelier. But between gulps of Meyer's best whiskey, he was shrewd, calculating, hungry. Not just for liquor, but for enterprise, and he found what he was looking for. When Long was sufficiently loose, but still coherent, he was ushered into Luciano's suite. The big players were there, Luciano, Lansky, Costello, and Mo Dalitz out of Cleveland. Together, they laid the groundwork for a southern outpost. The parishes around New Orleans would be opened wide to the syndicate. High-end casinos for the whales, nickel slots and punch boards for the average man. It would be Louisiana's back door into the national syndicate and Huey Long's personal ATM. To run the operation, Luciano tapped Dandy Phil Castell, a sharp-dressed veteran of the Rothstein years, and Costello's partner in New York's slot machine racket. Castell, polished and dangerous, would oversee the transformation of New Orleans into a gambler's paradise. From the Roosevelt Hotel, he managed the show with help from Seymour Weiss, one of Lansky's most trusted men. Within 2 years, Long was gone, assassinated, but not before pocketing an estimated $3 million from the deal. "We were practically buying the guy gold-plated underwear," one of them joked later. But for us, that deal was platinum. From this foundation would rise the New Orleans outfit, one of the oldest and most insulated mobs in America. Long's enforcers, like Sylvester Silver Dollar Sam Carollo, laid the groundwork. A young Carlos Marcello, still dabbling in marijuana and low-end enforcement work, was already making waves. Within a few years, Costello would be calling him one of his most reliable men in the Gulf region. Marcello wasn't just Italian muscle. He had mixed crews, Jewish partners, black muscle, and an instinct for blending brute force with political finesse. He was perfectly suited for Costello's version of the American Mafia, a family business with shareholders of every background. President Franklin Roosevelt, for all his bold talk and big promises, never laid a finger on Huey Long's Southern machine. He couldn't. Long was a political Frankenstein, part populist, part tyrant, and always a threat to run against FDR in the primaries. But deep down, they both knew the truth. Roosevelt needed Long left untouched, and Long needed a bigger cut of the pie. Still, for Luciano and his crew, the Long deal was a side bonus. The main game was at the convention hall in the old stockyards, where America's next president was being brokered. We waited until the last minute, one insider recalled, and we had Roosevelt and Smith people coming out to our ears. Everyone knew we controlled the New York delegates. Without 'em, Smith was dead in the water. And Roosevelt? He needed New York to prove he could carry his own state. If he couldn't, the other big players were ready to jump ship and find someone else. The switch, when it came, was orchestrated like a mob hit, clean, fast, and silent. John Nance Garner's shift was the crack in the dam. Luciano had already squared it with Marinelli. They would back Roosevelt if he promised to shut down the Seabury investigations that were threatening to unravel Tammany Hall and their entire East Coast network. Luciano, Lansky, and Costello met privately with their political allies. James Curley out of Boston, Tom Pendergast from Kansas City, Huey Long and a few others, with enough sway to bend steel. When word came back that Roosevelt would bury the Seabury cases quietly, just enough to save face, but not enough to hurt anyone, Luciano gave the nod. The New York delegation flipped, and so did the course of American history. The decision was made. Roosevelt would get their backing. But someone still had to deliver the death sentence to Al Smith, the once beloved icon of Tammany, the man whose name still rang out like an anthem in the smoke-filled backrooms of New York politics. Marinelli should have done it. He was Smith's man, a loyal soldier, but he couldn't bring himself to break the old lion's heart. So, the burden fell on Luciano. Outwardly, Charlie Lucky had played the role of a Smith supporter, but behind the velvet curtains, he and Costello had flipped the game board. And in their world, this wasn't politics. It was business and business. When you cut someone out, you do it face to face. I always saw Al Smith like a don, Luciano would later say. And when you knock off a don, you don't do it with a telegram. That night, under cover of darkness, Luciano slipped quietly through the Drake Hotel and up to Smith's suite. The air was thick with betrayal, and, when he knocked on the door, he knew he wasn't just delivering unwelcome news. He was ending an era. Inside, he laid it out flat. I told him Roosevelt was going to win, Charlie recalled. No way around it. We had to back him. The decision was made. Smith pushed back, pleaded even. He urged Luciano to hold the line, to keep the delegates behind him. But it was done. The gears were already turning. Smith, no fool, cut to the heart of it. What's the deal, Charlie? Luciano didn't flinch. Roosevelt promised to shut down Seabury. Keep his mouth shut and his eyes shut, that's the play. What happened next stayed with Luciano for the rest of his life. Al Smith, the happy warrior, the toughest old bastard to ever crawl out of New York's immigrant slums, started to cry. Not quite tears, but full, gut-wrenching sobs. He staggered around the room like a man watching his own funeral, his head in his hands, choking on the betrayal. You fellas are crazy, he said through the tears. I would have murdered Seabury for you. But it was too late, and they both knew it. When Luciano turned to leave, Smith pulled himself together. No more crying. No more weakness. The old warrior returned to form, straightened his back, and placed a hand on Charlie's shoulder. His voice was calm, but deadly serious. Charlie, he said, locking eyes with him. Frank Roosevelt's going to break his word to you. This is the biggest mistake you've ever made. Trust in him, he'll kill you. Luciano walked out shaken. His knees weak and deep down, every bone in his body was screaming the same thing. Smith was right. What none of them saw, what Smith sensed before any of them, was that Franklin Delano Roosevelt wasn't some genteel aristocrat playing politics with a handshake and a promise. He was something else entirely. A master manipulator, an opportunist, a man who would use the underworld's help as long as it served him, and then slice their throats clean as soon as the crown was on his head. No sooner had Roosevelt secured the nomination than he turned them on. He called a press conference in Albany and declared war on corruption in New York City. "Public office is a public trust," he said, borrowing the very phrase Fiorello LaGuardia had whispered in his ear just weeks earlier. And with that, he turned Seabury loose. The judge they thought was finished suddenly had carte blanche to drag every crook in Tammany Hall into the spotlight. Subpoenas, interrogations, no immunity, no favors, no cover. Roosevelt didn't need the machine anymore. It had served its purpose. Now it was ballast, dead weight he was all too happy to cut loose. Luciano, looking back, could only shake his head. "Yeah, Roosevelt was a prick," he said. "But smooth. Real smooth, and I should have told Frank and Meyer about that feeling I had in Chicago. Because once it played out, it was clear as day. He did exactly what I would have done in his shoes." Luciano had offed Masseria and Maranzano to clear his path. Roosevelt didn't need bullets. He used the law. "In the end," Charlie said, "we was the same. Only difference was that what I did was illegal, and what he did was perfectly legal. But we were both double-crossing sons of bitches." Did they make Roosevelt president? Maybe not entirely, but they gave him a hell of a push. And Luciano never forgot what it felt like to realize the next commander-in-chief of the United States had stabbed him in the back. "I always knew politicians were dirty. You could buy 'em any time. But I never thought one who was going to be president would play it like that." Roosevelt, emboldened by the nomination, let Seabury torch the city. One by one, Tammany stalwarts were marched in front of the committee. The press had a field day with the mountains of dirty money, the sordid backroom deals, the clear connections to the mob, and then came Jimmy Walker. The dapper, glad-handing mayor of New York, Tammany's crown jewel, found himself under the white-hot glare of Seabury's questioning. He twisted, he dodged, he smiled, but it was no use. Roosevelt had already prepared to move against him. Before he could, Walker sent a terse telegram. "Here be resign as mayor of New York City, James J. Walker." The next day, Walker was on a boat to Paris with his showgirl mistress Betty Compton, vanishing into exile while the scandal swirled behind him. The fallout was immediate and devastating. Seabury pulled the curtain back on decades of Tammany corruption. A tidal wave of outrage swept through the city. Careers were destroyed, reputations vaporized, and eventually even Jimmy Hines, Roosevelt's back-channel man during the convention, would end up rotting in a Sing Sing cell. The old order had fallen. New York was done with the good old days. As Prohibition staggered to its end, the headlines that once glorified the underworld began to work against it. The liquor kings who built empires on booze were now high-profile liabilities, visible enough to draw public outrage, yet still slippery enough to dodge justice. The system was rotting from within. The FBI wouldn't touch them. Immigration couldn't boot them. Local law enforcement, bought and paid for. But one force had both the muscle and the mandate, the federal taxman, backed by Franklin D. Roosevelt, and an inner circle that was finally ready to clean house. The first domino to fall was Al Capone, taken down not by bullets or turf wars, but by an accountant's ledger and a tax form. Next on the list was Waxy Gordon, and after him, Dutch Schultz. It was around Christmas of 1932 when Luciano and Frank Costello got the word. The feds had circled Schultz's name in red. He was the next one in the crosshairs. Born Arthur Flegenheimer in Yorkville, Schultz had started his life just like any other Bronx street kid, being poor and hungry. By 17, he'd already been arrested, and by the early 1930s, he was one of the most feared racketeers in America. He blamed it all on the name. "If I'd kept Flegenheimer," he once muttered, "no one would have ever heard of me." Schultz fit better in the headlines. He wasn't wrong. The Dutchman ran the Bronx like a private kingdom. He owned the beer, controlled the restaurants, and even had a grip on the meat and produce routes. He once told Luciano, "You give 'em clothes, I give 'em food. The public should thank us." But his biggest earner was policy, the underground lottery that sucked in nickels and dimes from Harlem to Hell's Kitchen. Schultz muscled in on independent black bankers like Wilfred Brunder and Alexander Pompez, and with Luciano's blessing, took over the racket entirely. His banks pulled in more than $35,000 a day, and thanks to his math genius, Otto Abadaba Berman, a guy who chain-smoked candy bars and could rewire numbers like Houdini, Schultz pushed the odds in his favor, squeezing every extra dollar from every losing ticket. Despite the money, Schultz lived like a miser. He dressed like a pig, someone once said, had a couple million but wouldn't spend more than $35 on a suit, and it had to come with 2 pairs of pants. He loved reading about himself in the paper, but only if the paper cost 2 cents. Still, Luciano respected him. I didn't have to like the guy, but I could count on him, and when he clipped Coll, he did me a favor. Vincent Mad Dog Coll, a contract killer hired by Maranzano to whack Luciano, had gotten greedy. He tried to muscle in on Schultz's operation. Schultz wasn't having it. Coll declared war. The war ended inside a phone booth on West 23rd Street. A volley of machine gun fire turned Coll into Swiss cheese. He was nuts, Luciano said, trying to shoot his way into Dutch's racket. But bullets weren't Schultz's biggest problem anymore. Uncle Sam was knocking. The indictment came in 1933, 3 years of unpaid taxes, nearly $500,000 in unreported income, mostly from bootlegging. He owed the feds $92,000, plus fines and interest, and was looking at 43 years behind bars. The man behind the case was a rising federal prosecutor named Thomas Dewey, young, ambitious, and hell-bent on making a name for himself as the underworld's worst nightmare. He'd already nailed Legs Diamond and Waxy Gordon. Schultz was next. But the Dutchman wasn't going quietly. Despite 50,000 wanted posters plastered across New York, he moved through the city like a ghost. His addresses were known to cops, to politicians, and to Tammany men like Jimmy Hines, his partner in the numbers racket. He dined in public, made the rounds at nightclubs, and kept his regular appointments with Polly Adler's girls. The police weren't hunting him, they were chauffeuring him. But every charade has a shelf life. By mid-1934, Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau had seen enough. He leaned on J. Edgar Hoover, who branded Schultz public enemy #1 and ordered the Bureau to bring him in. Morgenthau also forged an alliance with New York's new mayor, Fiorello LaGuardia, the pint-sized bulldog who rode into office on an anti-corruption crusade. LaGuardia wasted no time. He told Police Commissioner Louis Valentine, "Get your men off their butts and find Schultz." Suddenly Schultz was on the run for real. He went underground and straight to Luciano. Charlie Lucky sent him to Albert Anastasia, who offered him sanctuary in Brooklyn under heavy guard. Meanwhile, LaGuardia was tossing firebombs of his own at Luciano. The Little Flower ordered mass roundups. Luciano, Costello, Joe Adonis, Willie Moretti, every name in the New York books. Luciano recalled the moment clearly. "It's New Year's and this cop stops me on the street. Says the commissioner wants to see me. I figure he wants to talk shop. New mayor, maybe a new deal. Turns out it's just a show. I get to headquarters. Commissioner Orion's waiting. He says, "Charlie, I'm sorry. We had to bring you in. You can go home now." I was there 10 minutes. Tops. Same show. Different cast. Moretti got the treatment too. Picked up at the ferry, chauffeured back home. The headlines were great. The message? Hollow. But LaGuardia wasn't finished. He dumped hundreds of Costello's slot machines into the East River. Cameras rolling, reporters scribbling, the mayor's name in every column. Still, Luciano couldn't figure him out. He was a wop like the rest of us, half Jewish. I came from the Bronx. What did he want? We offered to make him rich. He didn't even listen. Let him have City Hall. We had everything else. The DA, the cops, the judges, LaGuardia, though, had the spotlight. And he wasn't giving it up. As the net tightened around Schultz, pressure mounted on the rest of the syndicate. But Luciano and Lansky saw opportunity. At the Waldorf, during a meeting on their Cuban casino operation, Lansky laid it out. If Schultz went down, his empire would be divided, under Luciano's guidance. Luciano agreed, but had his own problems. LaGuardia's on my back. Maybe we should let Dewey know he nailed Waxy thanks to me. Might make him ease up. The message reached Dewey. His answer? Cold and cryptic. Tell Luciano. Someday I'll show him my gratitude in court. Luciano thought it was a gesture. Albert Marinelli corrected him. It's a threat. Meanwhile, Schultz's grip on his operation was slipping. He couldn't manage from the shadows. His lawyer, Richard Dixie Davis, floated a bold idea. Offer the government $100,000 to settle the whole thing. At first, the Dutchman balked, but he was desperate. Morgenthau shut it down. We don't do business with criminals. Cornered, Schultz feared he'd end up like John Dillinger, dead on the pavement. So in November 1934, he surrendered in Albany. Spent a few weeks behind bars while lawyers haggled over bail, eventually set at $75,000. The Dutchman had entered the endgame.